Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. This is your ultimate guide to homemade kombucha. If you've been watching the videos on my channel, you're probably thinking you already have a guide to first fermentation and second fermentation. Why are you filming a whole other video about it? So I actually filmed that video a few years back, and while the recipe hasn't really changed and a lot of the materials that I use are still the same, I have made a few tweaks to the process just to make it a little bit more efficient. I've been able to test out a few other different products that I now have decided are my tried and true products compared to the first video that I filmed a few years back. And so I figured I would just go ahead and film a complete, all-encompassing F1 and F2 video that includes all of the steps of fermentation, so that one, for viewers who are already familiar with my channel, you can see what my updated current process of brewing kombucha is. And so if there are any new people who haven't watched my videos on this channel before, you can use this as the main video that'll walk you through the entire process of making kombucha from start to finish. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll just share a few quick intro details about what kombucha is for people who aren't familiar, but it's basically just fermented tea. All you need to make kombucha is fresh filtered water, tea. I'm partial to black tea, but you can use any kind of tea as long as it's pure tea made from the Camellia sinensis plant. Herbal teas and herbal infusions that are not made of true tea don't get properly digested and processed by the kombucha culture. So I recommend steering clear of those types of non-tea herbal infusions for kombucha. If you're curious about that, I have a whole other video on that, so definitely check it out if you're curious. But for the purposes of this video, we're just going to use straight up plain black tea. The next ingredient is sugar. Kombucha is made with just plain white cane sugar. Brown sugar, honey, stevia, other types of alternate sweeteners don't get properly digested by the kombucha culture either, so I always recommend just sticking to plain white cane sugar. The last ingredient in making kombucha is a SCOBY. So SCOBY is actually an acronym that stands for Symbiotic Culture of Bacteria and Yeast. And there's a lot of conversation in the home brewing community about what the SCOBY actually is, because there are a lot of people that refer to this gnarly looking thing as the SCOBY. Some people actually refer to it as the pellicle or the mushroom or the mother. It's got a lot of different names. But in reality, the symbiotic culture, so the bacteria and yeast, don't actually live in this pellicle, in this physical mat. It actually lives in the kombucha itself, in the liquid. So the bacteria and yeast don't just live in this SCOBY, and technically the starter tea is also the SCOBY. But if you're new to brewing kombucha, you're gonna wanna get your hands on a good amount of starter tea and a SCOBY to get started brewing. And you can do this a couple of different ways. I recommend going to a reputable online seller that sells SCOBYs or pellicles and starter tea, and just making sure that you purchase a good amount of starter tea. I have another video dedicated to how you can acquire a good quality SCOBY and how you can make one from scratch from a bottle of kombucha. So I'll put links to those videos down in the description box below if you're curious about that. But another way that you acquire starter tea or starter culture to make your kombucha is from a previously brewed batch of kombucha. So if you have a friend who is a kombucha homebrewer, ask them for some starter tea and a SCOBY. Or if you have already previously brewed a batch of kombucha, make sure to save about 2 cups of that kombucha tea or that liquid, and to save the pellicle, because that's basically what you'll be using as starter tea for your next batch of kombucha. So to recap, all you need to make kombucha is water, tea, sugar, and a kombucha starter. We're gonna be making 1 gallon of kombucha today. So to get started, I'm basically going to make a tea concentrate. And the reason why I make a tea concentrate is because the kombucha culture can't survive in hot temperatures above, say, 90-95 degrees Fahrenheit. So I don't wanna put it in a gallon's worth of really hot, scalding, boiling tea. So what I'm going to do to start off is basically make a tea concentrate that I will then dilute with room temperature water to get it to a safe enough temperature for the SCOBY. So we're going to take my French press And you don't necessarily have to use a French press for this. If you don't have one, you can just use a strainer and a pot, whatever you prefer to steep your tea. I'm really partial to black tea for kombucha brewing because I find that the really rich floral and honey-like qualities of a really good quality black tea work really well with the flavors of kombucha. So I'm really partial to using black tea. I also find that it produces a really consistent brew. I never have issues with carbonation or flavor, and it just produces really consistently healthy kombucha cultures or SCOBYs over time. So here I have a couple of different types of black tea, and you can actually use any kind of tea to make kombucha, whether you like green tea or white tea or oolong tea, yellow tea or pu'er tea. As long as it's made of the Camellia sinensis plant, again, you can use it for kombucha. But my favorites for brewing kombucha are black tea, and I have two different kinds here. One is English breakfast. An English breakfast is actually a blend of a few different pure black teas from a couple of different growing regions. And every tea source or tea seller has a slightly different blend that they like to turn into their English breakfast blend. It's a custom blend depending on the tea seller. I like to use English breakfast because it's a good all-around black tea. And then I also like Assam black tea because this particular Assam tea has really beautiful floral, honey-like, almost Darjeeling-like qualities. And I find that it makes for a delicious tasting brew. So I have some hot water that has been boiling in an electric kettle. So I'm just gonna put about 2 tablespoons of English breakfast loose leaf tea into my French press. It's 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons, and 1 tablespoon of Assam black tea. At this stage, I'm actually also going to add my sugar into the French press. So for each gallon of kombucha, I recommend using between 3/4 cup of sugar and 1 cup of sugar. So almost filling this 1 cup dry measure to the brim. That goes in. And then I'm going to add my water. People also ask me why I like to add the sugar in at this stage, knowing that I am going to be straining out the tea leaves. And so some of that sugar is going to stay behind along with those tea leaves. I like adding it at this stage because the water is hot right now and it just makes the sugar a lot easier to dissolve. But if you want to strain your tea leaves out, then mix the sugar in at that point and then add it into the cool water, you can add the sugar in at any step in the process. It really is just up to your personal preference. And I have found that even if some of that sugar remains behind with the tea that I discard, it doesn't really affect the brew. A lot of these measurements are just approximate, so you don't really need to be super, super precise with it, as long as you're in the ballpark range. So this tea is going to steep for around 10 to 15 minutes or so. So because I'm brewing with loose leaf tea, the tea leaves are larger than what you'd actually find in a tea bag, which is basically just pulverized tea dust. And so loose leaf tea can withstand longer brewing times than if you were using tea bags. But if you have really high quality tea bags or you prefer using tea bags, you can just use about between 6 to 9 individual tea bags for each gallon batch of kombucha. So I'm just gonna let this steep for about 10 minutes and then we'll come right back. So it's been about 10 minutes and our tea is done steeping, so I'm gonna go ahead and strain it out. So this is going to be my brew vessel. What I'm gonna do is go ahead and just add some water to the bottom of it to make sure that the glass doesn't break when we add a very hot liquid to it. So if you add boiling hot water to glass, the drastic change in temperature can make the glass crack. So to prevent that from happening, we're just gonna cushion the hot tea with a little bit of water at the bottom. And as you can see, I'm not really being super precise about measuring the water, either for the steeping vessel or for the brew vessel itself. And that's primarily because I know that this gallon jar contains 1 gallon of liquid, and basically I'm just going to eyeball it to make sure that I'm adding enough water to fill the vessel to the top. This tea concentrate, it also doesn't really matter how much water you steep your tea in. I recommend at least 2 to 3 cups. I probably put in around more than 4 cups. I'm bad with estimating, but I put in a good amount of water in the French press just to make sure that the tea has enough room to bloom and steep and expand. But again, the whole purpose of doing this was just to make a very concentrated amount of tea that we were then just going to dilute with water to get it to a hospitable temperature for the SCOBY. So here we have our hot tea. I'm just going to go ahead and add more water to the vessel. So I leave a little bit of airspace up at the top of the gallon brewing vessel just because I want to make sure that there's enough room to add my starter tea and my SCOBY or my pellicle at the top of the vessel. And so now we're going to move on to really the most important ingredient in this whole mix, which is our starter tea. A lot of kombucha recipes online recommend using about 1 cup of starter tea per gallon batch of kombucha. I actually really recommend using at least 2 cups of super strong starter tea or kombucha tea per gallon batch of kombucha. And the reason for that is because the starter tea is where a lot of the good beneficial bacteria and yeast live. The faster that those bacteria and yeast can inoculate and bring the pH of your sweet tea down, the less likely you are to grow mold, and the faster you basically kickstart that fermentation process. So rather than being stingy with my starter tea, I'd rather just add double the amount, use it as an extra precaution to make sure that my kombucha is starting off on the right foot. And again, I will link down in the description box below where you can acquire good quality starter tea and a pellicle, or if you are already brewing kombucha, all you have to do is make sure that you are reserving at least 2 cups of kombucha tea from a previously brewed batch of kombucha. So now we are going to add our starter kombucha culture into our brewing vessel. And before I do that, I'm just going to take a temperature read of the liquid because you want to make sure that the liquid is below 90 degrees but above 65 degrees to make sure that it's the ideal temperature for the SCOBY. So we are at about 95 degrees, so I'm actually just going to add a bit more room temperature water to make it a little bit cooler. Give that a stir. And another read. We are at 87. Awesome. And now we are ready to add our SCOBY or our pellicle. You can also call this the mother, the mushroom, the kombucha starter. It has a lot of different names, but this gnarly looking thing is going in our brewing vessel along with 2 cups of really strong starter tea. Now I got this from a SCOBY hotel of mine because I have been brewing for a very long time. I like to keep a SCOBY hotel basically just as a receptacle to keep my excess pellicles and also to basically serve as a factory for supercharged, super acidic kombucha. So I like to use really acidic starter tea to brew my kombucha because that makes for the most delicious tasting kombucha in my opinion. And using this method, I have never really encountered mold in my batches. So it's another really good way to make sure that your kombucha is resilient is by using really low pH, high acidic starter tea. If you're curious about building a SCOBY hotel, definitely check out my video on SCOBY hotels. I'll link that down below as well. But for now, we're just gonna go ahead and add the starter tea into our batch. Look at that, right up until the top. And I'm actually just gonna give it a quick stir to make sure that starter tea is well incorporated throughout the brew. And that's it. From here, all you have to do is cover it with a clean cloth, secure it with a rubber band. You just want to keep this stored in a place that's away from direct sunlight and has a good amount of airflow. If you're curious about my recommendations on where to house your kombucha brewing vessels, definitely check out my video on locations where I go into more detail about that. But at this point, it is ready to just hang out for about a week or so. It doesn't really matter whether the pellicle sinks or floats, so over the course of that time, you might see that it either just settles at the top of the vessel, or you might just see it hanging out in the middle or down below. That really doesn't matter. It's not an indicator of anything good or bad. You'll usually find that a new pellicle or a new SCOBY will attempt to form at the surface of the liquid. I have a whole other video on what to expect during the first fermentation process if you're curious about the details and what you can expect as you wait for this batch of kombucha to finish fermenting. But a couple of common questions that I get from brewers is, I'm seeing some like white specks at the surface of my vessel. It's been about 3 days and I can't tell if it's mold or if it's the new SCOBY forming. In that case, odds are that's a SCOBY that's trying to form and get a little bit thicker. So if you're concerned that it's mold, I recommend just giving it a few more days and waiting it out to see if it turns into a more cohesive SCOBY or if it turns into something that's unmistakably mold. If it is mold, it looks like the classic circular mold that you find on bread or on cheese, so it should be fairly easily identifiable. Kombucha mold doesn't really look that different from other mold that you encounter on other fruits or veggies or food. And then another question that I get from homebrewers is, can the formation of a new SCOBY actually indicate when your kombucha is done fermenting? And the answer in short is no. SCOBY growth or SCOBY formation is a good indicator that fermentation is happening, but it can't really tell you when your kombucha is done fermenting. And the reason why it can't tell you that is because different variables and different factors actually affect the growth of a new SCOBY. So I actually find that in the wintertime, when the temperature is colder, my brews don't always grow a new SCOBY with each batch. Sometimes a thin film, a super thin opaque film, will form over the top of my brew vessel, and sometimes nothing will happen to it, but it will continue to actually ferment. And I know that it's fermenting because as I taste it, it's continuing to acidify. So it's getting a little bit more tart. A little bit of that sweetness will continue to basically disappear over the course of time, and that's how I know that fermentation is happening. You can also test the pH of the brew over time using different pH testers or test strips. I have a whole other video dedicated to checking kombucha pH, so if you're curious about that, you can check that video out. But in my day-to-day brewing, I basically never really use my pH meters because I've gotten into a rhythm. I know how my particular kombucha culture behaves, and I know what to look out for when it comes to successful fermentation. And that's basically just when it starts to taste more acidic. The main way to tell when your kombucha is done fermenting and done with first fermentation is basically when it tastes done to you. So I recommend starting to taste it right around the 5-day mark if you're curious. If it's super hot where you live, fermentation will be accelerated by warmer temperatures. So if you live in a warmer climate, you might want to start tasting after day 3 or day 4. But where I'm at, it's a pretty moderate climate. So average room temperature in my home is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And I find that my brews tend to take between a week or 2 to get to the perfect sweet tart spot that I like. There's also a lot of conversation within the kombucha homebrewing community about the pellicle and whether or not it's actually necessary to include a pellicle when you're brewing a new batch of kombucha, especially because the majority of the beneficial bacteria and yeast, like I mentioned, lives within the starter tea. So do you actually need to use a pellicle when you're brewing a new batch of kombucha, or is this just a byproduct of fermentation that doesn't really do anything and you can actually just discard it? So I've done a lot of side-by-side tests to basically test this theory out, and what I've found is that batches where I use both 2 cups of strong starter tea plus a pellicle or a physical SCOBY mat, those batches tend to drop in pH faster and ferment a little bit faster than batches where I only use 2 cups of strong starter tea. So in both cases, fermentation happens. In both cases, you end up with a batch of successfully fermented kombucha. But because in my side-by-side tests, I've found that batches that have starter tea and a pellicle tend to ferment faster, I just find that it's better to just include it anyhow to give my kombucha the best shot at being a successful brew as I possibly can. So if you're staunchly against using a pellicle, or if you find that it's just an unnecessary part of your brewing process, then no worries, you definitely don't need to use the pellicle. Like I mentioned, it's really just having that foundation of really strong acidic starter tea that is going to kickstart the fermentation. So that's really the most important part. So we're basically just gonna let this hang out for about a week or so until it gets to that perfect level of sweet tart that I like, and then we're ready to move on to the second fermentation phase. So we'll check back in on this in about a week. And we're back. So it's been about a week since we first got this first ferment started, and as you can see, it's definitely lightened a bit in color. And across the top of the vessel, there is a very thin pellicle that has started to form. I don't know if you can see it, but as soon as I take the lid off, I'll show it to you. It's very translucent at this point because it's a bit cooler right now in my home. And so cooler temperatures generally result in thinner SCOBY growth or no SCOBY growth at all. Again, that's perfectly fine, totally normal. And you can see that the original pellicle has sunk to the bottom of the brew vessel. Also totally fine as well. But the main thing that I am testing for when it comes to doneness is just taste. So if you have just a straw that you want to use to peek into your brew vessel like that and give it a taste, it should have a good bit of acidity. It shouldn't be sour like vinegar, but it should be less sweet than the brew that you started out with. So just a little bit of tanginess there, still some good sweetness. The black tea, the flavors of the black tea are definitely still coming through. I think this is ready to bottle. So to start with clean hands, just go ahead and lift the SCOBY or the pellicle out of the brew. And this has only been fermenting for about a week. And so the SCOBY growth is very thin, as you can see, super translucent. And the longer you let this ferment, say if you wanted to ferment this for 2 weeks, if you really wanted it to be a little bit more tart, you could absolutely let this continue to ferment for as long as you like, really. And the brew will just continue to get more acidic, and that's totally fine. Just take this SCOBY right there. And just to make sure that your next batch of kombucha has enough starter tea, you want to just give the brew a stir to basically kick up any sediment and yeast that has settled down at the bottom of the brew vessel, just to make sure that the brew is fully homogeneous there. And I'm just gonna pour maybe 16 ounces worth. You basically want to take some of the kombucha liquid and set it aside, because this is going to be the starter tea that you use to make a fresh batch of kombucha moving forward. So you can go ahead and start brewing a new batch of kombucha with this right away. Or if you have a SCOBY hotel, I happen to have a few SCOBY hotels where I keep my stockpile of extra pellicles and extra starter tea. You can go ahead and keep this in your SCOBY hotel as well. So I'm just going to put this aside for now. This is actually one of my SCOBY hotels over there, so I'm just gonna put that in my SCOBY hotel later. But the rest of this brew is what we're going to go ahead and bottle and flavor. So this is actually drinkable as is. If you're not interested in carbonating your kombucha, or if you're not interested in flavoring it with any fruit flavorings, then you don't need to go through the following process that I'm about to show you. It's completely optional. However, if you want carbonation and if you want to flavor it with fruits and herbs, then keep watching, because I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. The remaining kombucha tea that has been fermented here, I'm just going to give it another stir to make sure that it's well incorporated. And it's totally normal to see yeasty, stringy brown bits floating around the liquid. That is just yeast, and they're friendly. They're healthy. No worries. Oh, you can just pass it through a strainer to make sure that you get any of the stringy, yeasty bits out of the brew. So at this point, this brew is ready to flavor and bottle. I prefer flavoring with fresh fruit, but if you're curious about how I prep my flavorings, I have a whole other video dedicated to how I prep my fruit flavorings, how I prep my herb flavorings. So definitely check those videos out. I'll link them down in the description box below. So what I have here is about a pound of strawberries that I pureed with a knob of ginger and a couple tablespoons-ish of white sugar. I'm never too precise when it comes to measuring fruit, because I usually just go to the grocery store, grab whatever looks appealing to me in the moment, and so I don't really get too precise with the measurements. But if you want an approximation of how much I'm using, this is about a pound of strawberries, a knob of ginger, maybe 3 thumbs worth of ginger-ish, and then a couple tablespoons of sugar. I'm gonna go ahead and just add this into the pitcher to mix it in. And I'm gonna start with half, or a little more than half, just to see if the flavor is at the right level that I like. Because you can always add more, but you can't take it out once it's in. So it's good to just do it in stages. Just take a straw to taste it. Definitely use a little bit more. So I am gonna go ahead and add the rest of this. And depending on the different flavorings you use, you may find that you want to add more or add less. This is the part of kombucha brewing that's really subjective, just based on individual taste preferences. But what I find to make successful kombucha, generally fresh fruit results in more consistent carbonation. Just gonna give this another quick taste test. Perfect, perfect. Definitely get the ginger peeking through. The strawberries taste really fresh and sweet. What I'm looking for when it comes to tasting at this stage of the game is something that's a little too sweet for my liking. And the reason why I'm aiming for something that's a little too sweet is because over the course of the second fermentation process, as the kombucha continues to ferment at room temperature in the bottle, it will continue to acidify and it'll continue to get less sweet over the course of that time. So right now, I want it to be a little too sweet for my liking so that at the end of that second fermentation process, it'll be right around the perfect level of sweet tart. So that is the reason why I like to aim for something a little more sweet. Because it's actually really important to make sure that you're stirring continuously, because this is a natural product. That fruit pulp or the strawberry puree will have a tendency to settle at the bottom of whatever vessel it's in. And so just for this phase, while I'm distributing it across all these bottles, I want to make sure to stir continuously so that the brew is as homogeneous as possible. But at this point, I'm going to add these into my bottles. And if you're curious about where I got these bottles, I have a whole video dedicated to choosing the right bottles and caps for kombucha making. I have a couple videos about that actually, so I will link them down in the description box below if you're curious about how to choose quality bottles to make sure that you don't have any bottle explosions happen. I know that's a really common fear, especially for new homebrewers, is what happens if the bottle gets overpressurized and it explodes, and should I burp my bottles every day to basically prevent that explosion from happening? And on both accounts, the answer is that burping is not necessary, and I wouldn't be too concerned about bottle explosions happening as long as you're using quality pressure-rated bottles. And again, I go into a lot of details about how to find those bottles on my website and in the videos that I link down below. Just gonna pause really quickly just to give it another stir partway through. So there we have it, all of our beautiful filled bottles of kombucha. Now we're going to cap these bottles. And caps are really important. I mentioned this in a few of my other videos, but you really want to make sure that you're using caps that are airtight, because if you don't get an airtight seal with these bottles, they are not going to carbonate properly. Basically, what you want to do is make sure that you're trapping the carbonation in the liquid so that it doesn't escape out of the bottle. And that's what'll make sure that your kombucha will be as carbonated as possible. Just cap them all. And then lastly, to make sure that these are as tightly sealed as possible, I like to use just a basic rubber jar opener, jar gripper, to just make sure that they're extra tight. So at this point, these bottles are going to need to continue to ferment at room temperature for at least a few more days. My bottles, depending on how warm it is, typically take between 3 to 7 days to carbonate to the level of carbonation that I like them to be at. There are a lot of different factors that contribute to how fast fermentation happens. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, warmer temperatures speed up fermentation and cooler temperatures generally slow it down. So in the wintertime, you might find that it takes maybe a week or so for your kombucha to carbonate to the level of fizziness that you like. In the summer, you might find that it happens really quickly. It really just depends on the temperature and your particular kombucha cultures. Basically, the unique yeast and bacteria that live in your particular kombucha culture affect that rate of fermentation. A lot of homebrewers are torn on the topic of burping kombucha bottles. There is a camp of kombucha brewers that think, oh, you should burp your kombucha bottles regularly or burp them daily to prevent bottle explosions from happening. I have a whole other video dedicated to why I'm against burping and why I don't burp my kombucha bottles. But the reason why I don't burp my kombucha bottles is because I want there to be carbonation in the liquid. And so the more I open the bottle over the course of that fermentation process, the more I'm releasing that carbonation into the air. So it's basically like taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back every single time I pop a top open and try to check for carbonation. Now, if you're brand new to brewing, absolutely, definitely go through and burp your bottles and check to see if fermentation is happening. Check to see if they're getting fizzier as the days progress. But now that I'm really familiar with how my brews ferment, I don't ever really burp my bottles. Another great thing about these particular caps, and I talk about this in my other video about these bottle caps, is because these aren't like the traditional kind of flip top bottles that most brewers use to brew kombucha, these have a very flat top that over the course of the fermentation process will actually dome and very slightly bubble upward a little bit. So that domed top is actually a really great indicator that fermentation has happened, that the bottles are pressurized, and that carbonation is building up in the liquid. So that's another reason why I don't really find any need to burp my bottles. And then lastly, another reason why I don't burp my bottles is because warmer temperatures actually greatly exaggerate carbonation. So if you take 2 identical kombucha bottles, same flavor, same batch, and you chill one of them, but leave one of them at room temperature, the one at room temperature, when opened, will basically fizzy up and appear to be way more carbonated than the same bottle that is chilled to a colder temperature. And that's because colder temperatures basically help trap the carbon dioxide in the liquid better than warmer temperatures do. So another reason why I don't like to burp my bottles is because over the course of that burping, if you're burping at room temperature, you could basically open a bottle and see that the carbonation is pretty exaggerated. It might even fizzy up and make a mess outside of the bottle. It might spill over. And that could give you the indication that, oh my goodness, these bottles are overcarbonated. I need to move them to the refrigerator immediately, only to find that once they're chilled, they're really not that bubbly at all. And the reason for that, again, is because warmer temperatures exaggerate carbonation. So the best way to test if your bottle is at the right level of carbonation is basically, one, if you have these bottle caps, to check if it's domed enough, and that's a good indicator that enough carbonation has built up in the bottle. Or after a few days of letting these ferment at room temperature, just take one of the bottles and chill it in the fridge. Or if you want to do it really quickly, just pop it in the freezer for about 15 to 20 minutes. Just make sure that you're setting a timer so that you don't actually forget the bottle in the freezer. But once it's thoroughly chilled, at that point, go ahead and pop the top and see if it's at the desired level of fizziness that you like. Some people like their kombucha to be really carbonated and effervescent, and some people like just a little bit of carbonation. So no matter where you fall on that spectrum, you can really just adjust the schedule based on your taste preferences. And people also ask if you need to ferment these at room temperature at all. Do you need to go through a second fermentation process? And the answer is no. If you like the way this tastes as is and you're not interested in carbonating it, then you can just go ahead and move these straight into the refrigerator to chill. But if you do want to build up that carbonation, then definitely leave them at room temperature for a few days before you chill. But I guess back to what I was saying earlier, if you test one of the bottles and it's at that perfect level of carbonation, then you know that you can take the rest of the bottles and move them into the refrigerator. But if you find that it's not fizzy enough or you'd like a little bit more carbonation, then you can just take that bottle out of the refrigerator and then just let the rest of the bottles continue to ferment. And people also ask me, what happens if I put all of my bottles in the refrigerator and then I try one of them and it turns out that it's not really as fizzy as I want it to be? Can I take all of them out and let them continue fermenting at room temperature? And yes, you absolutely can. These are live living products. So when you put your kombucha in the fridge, it greatly slows down fermentation, but it doesn't kill the yeast and bacteria. It doesn't halt fermentation completely. It just makes it very slow. So if you find that you've put your kombucha in the refrigerator, but you actually want a little bit more carbonation, you can just take all of those bottles out, and continue fermenting them at room temperature for another couple of days until they get to that desired level of carbonation. If you're concerned about bottles exploding, or if you're testing out different bottles and you're not quite sure if they're pressure rated, definitely check out my video on what to do if you're afraid of bottles exploding for some tips on how to make sure that you're fermenting these safely. So we'll go ahead and let these ferment at room temperature for a few days, and then we'll check back in when they're ready to taste. And so some time has passed since we've bottled these brews. Since the last time we checked in on them, these have fermented at room temperature for about 5 or 6-ish days. I actually chilled one of these bottles at the 4-day mark, and once it was completely chilled, I checked it to see if it was at the level of carbonation that I preferred, and I found that it was still a little bit undercarbonated, so I let the rest of the bottles continue fermenting for a couple more days. So these were at room temperature for a total of about 6 days. And 6 days is about normal for this time of year for me. It's springtime in Los Angeles, so it's not super warm yet, but not really cold. And so my brews typically take between 3 days in the warmer summer months to carbonate to about a week to carbonate during the colder months. And so we're gonna go ahead and just open one of these bottles and give it a taste. And as you can see, this was our strawberry ginger batch, and a lot of sediment and that fruit pulp has settled in the brew. Sometimes they'll bunch up at the top of the liquid. Sometimes they'll sink down to the bottom. It doesn't really matter. I haven't noticed any difference in the quality of the kombucha either way, but because this is a little bit of a pulpier brew, I am gonna go ahead and strain it. It really just depends on your preferences, whether you wanna strain it or not. But because this is a little on the chunky side, I am gonna strain it. And my favorite way to open a bottle of kombucha is just to have these very simple rubber grippers. I get this from Amazon. I can put a link to it down in the description box below. But for these particular caps, and I love these caps a lot because you can actually take a look at them and see if the plastic has curved upward. That's another good way to see that carbonation has built up in the bottle. So that's why I prefer these bottles and caps over the kind of flip top Grolsch style bottles. We're gonna go ahead and open this. Just pop it open. You can see that carbonation building up. Oh my goodness. You want to make less of a mess than I did, use a funnel. But that is a beautifully bubbly fizzy brew right there. Just strain that pulp away. And you can see the color is just gorgeous, beautiful strawberry ginger brew. Perfect level of carbonation. Again, if you want it to be more fizzy or less fizzy, you can always just adjust how long you keep the batch at room temperature before you refrigerate it. And I always like to refrigerate my kombucha brews before I open any of them because cold liquids hold carbonation a lot better than warm or room temperature liquids. I hope this was really helpful. If you want to get another batch of kombucha going, just go ahead and use that reserved 2 cups of starter tea and the SCOBY from your unflavored kombucha to basically start the process over and brew another batch of kombucha. And one last tip that I will leave you with, as you troubleshoot and as you get to know your kombucha preferences and your particular SCOBY, one thing that really helped me learn at an accelerated rate when I was first learning how to brew kombucha is taking a lot of notes, taking really detailed notes about my brewing process, what worked, what didn't, and that really helped me hone my process and get to know my particular culture really well at a rapid pace. And so if you're interested in a logbook and a journal of sorts that you can use to not only find my recipes, find charts and guides and troubleshooting tips, and also keep track of all of your kombucha brewing processes, definitely check out my book, The Kombucha Crafter's Logbook. It's available for sale on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble. I'll pop a link to it down in the description box below, but I modeled that journal and guidebook based on the trackers and charts that I was using and made for myself when I was first learning how to brew, and I found that it really helped me just solidify the knowledge and understand the brewing process in a very science-based way. So definitely give that a look whether you're new to brewing or you're an experienced home brewer looking to up your game. There's something in that logbook for everybody. If you're curious about any other topics related to kombucha brewing, I hope you'll check out my website, youbrewkombucha.com. And I hope you found this video helpful. Happy brewing!